And here is our reading from this evening from the book of the prophet Hosea, chapter 4, as Hosea continues to catalogue the sins of the Israelites and God's judgment upon them. Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. There is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. There's only cursing, lying and murder, stealing and adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Because of this, the land dries up, and all who live in it waste away. The beasts of the field, the birds in the air, and the fish in the sea are swept away. But let no one bring a charge, let no one accuse another, for your people are like those who bring charges against a priest. You stumble day and night, and the prophets stumble with you, so I will destroy your mother. My people are destroyed from lack of knowledge. Because you've rejected knowledge, I also reject you as my priests. Because you've ignored the law of God, I will also ignore your children. The more priests there were, the more they sinned against me. They exchanged their glorious God for something disgraceful. They feed on the sins of my people and relish their wickedness. And it will be like people, like priests. I will punish both of them for their ways and repay them for their sins. They will eat but not have enough. They will engage in prostitution but not flourish, because they have deserted the Lord to give themselves to prostitution. Old wine and new wine take away their understanding. My people consult a wooden idol, and a diviner's rod speaks to them. The spirit of prostitution leads them astray. They are unfaithful to their God. They sacrifice on the mountaintops and burn offerings on the hills under oak, poplar, and terebinth, where the shade is pleasant. Therefore your daughters turn to prostitution, and your daughters-in-law to adultery. I will not punish your daughters when they turn to prostitution, nor your daughters-in-law when they commit adultery, because the men themselves consort with harlots and sacrifice with shrine prostitutes. A people without understanding will come to ruin. Though you, Israel, commit adultery, do not let Judah become guilty. Do not go to Gilgal, do not go up to Bethaven, do not swear, as surely as the Lord lives. The Israelites are stubborn, like a stubborn heifer. How then can the Lord pasture them like lambs in a meadow? Ephraim is joined to idols. Leave him alone. Even when their drinks are gone, they continue their prostitution. Their rulers dearly love shameful ways. A whirlwind will sweep them away, and their sacrifices will bring them shame. Fierce words there from God to his chosen people through the prophet. Warnings of judgment to come. Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. No faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. Only cursing, lie and murder, stealing and adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. And because of this, the land dries up. All who live in it waste away. The beasts of the field, the birds in the sky, and the fish in the sea are swept away. God's judgment coming on the sins of the Israelites. They were so severe, they were even bringing destruction on the promised land itself. People were breaking the commandments, lying and murder, stealing and adultery, breaking all bounds. Bloodshed follows bloodshed. And the root cause of all this evil and wickedness was actually what was lacking in the people. There's no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. When people do not have faith in God and have no love, do not even acknowledge God, all kinds of terrible sins do follow. It could be a description of society today, but remember, these charges are not being made against a pagan or a faithless nation who didn't know God. Israel was God's chosen people, his holy nation, his royal priesthood, his special possession. How much worse to say of them, there is no acknowledgement of God in the land. And who's to blame for this dreadful situation which God's chosen people have fallen into? Hosea goes on to explain that God's judgment is burning against a particular group. Let no one bring a charge. Let no one accuse another, for your people are like those who bring charges against a priest. Here's one of those verses in the Old Testament, Hosea 4, verse 4, where the Hebrew is difficult to understand. And that New International Version 2011 we just read doesn't really bring out the real meaning, but the New Revised Standard Version is a bit clearer. Let no one contend, let none accuse, for with you is my contention, O priests. Good News Bible says, the Lord says, let no one accuse the people or reprimand them. My complaint is against the priests. In this case, I think the New Living Translation makes the meaning most clear. Don't point your finger at someone else and try to pass the blame. My complaint to you priests is with you. Yes, God's judgment was on the whole nation of Israel. They'd all rejected God. They'd all drifted into worshipping idols and false gods. But the blame for that lay fairly and squarely on the shoulders of the priests. The very people God had entrusted with the spiritual life of Israel were the ones responsible for her downfall. Don't point your finger at someone else and try to pass the blame. My complaint to you priests is with you. The nation was to be destroyed because both the priests and the prophets, who should have been leading the Israelites to God, were failing in their callings. Verse 6, my people are destroyed from lack of knowledge. It was the special responsibility of the priests to teach the people the law of Moses so that they'd all obey the law. The priests were failing to do that. So God says, because you have rejected knowledge, I also reject you as my priests. Because you have ignored the law of your God, I also will ignore your children. The priests had taught the people to abandon God's law, so God would reject them. The lack of knowledge would bring destruction onto Israel. But the priests weren't just failing to teach the law, they were also bringing false teaching, actually leading the people to worship idols and false gods. They were encouraging everybody else into sins of idolatry. The more priests there were, the more they sinned against me. They exchanged their glorious God for something disgraceful. They feed on the sins of my people and relish their wickedness. So God's judgment would fall particularly on the heads of the priests who were leading the people into idol worship and worse. And this wasn't just spiritual prostitution, but the ritual prostitution of the fertility cults of the surrounding nations. They believed that sexual immorality in the temples of those pagan gods, drunken orgies, other despicable pagan rituals would produce good harvests. And the priests were taking their living for leading the people to worship these false gods and not the one true God, the glorious God who'd saved them and created Israel. So judgment would come. Verse 9, it will be like people, like priests. I'll punish both of them for their ways and repay them for their deeds. They will eat but not have enough. They will engage in prostitution, ritual prostitution, but not flourish, because they have deserted the Lord to give themselves to prostitution. Old wine and new wine take away their understanding. Instead of faithfully worshipping the one true God and Savior, the people were worshipping idols. My people consult a wooden idol. A diviner's rod speaks to them. Spirit of prostitution leads them astray. They're unfaithful to their God, as Hosea's wife, Gomer, had been unfaithful to him. The priests are even offering sacrifices to the pagan gods at their altars, which were built on the high places. They sacrifice on the mountaintops. They burn offering on the hills, under oak, poplar, and terebinth, where the shade is pleasant. And all this pagan worship was leading the ordinary people into all kinds of immorality. Your daughters turn to prostitution, your daughters-in-law to adultery. And God says he's not going to punish those women because the men themselves consort with harlots, sacrifice with shrine prostitutes. A people without understanding will come to ruin. This is the consequence of their sins. God's punishment will fall on the northern kingdom of Israel for their immorality, for their lack of understanding. There's a solemn warning for the southern kingdom of Judah there as well. Though you, Israel, commit adultery, do not let Judah become guilty. That southern kingdom was remain faithful to God at that time. They would need to stay firm, resist the same temptations. But Israel had already fallen too low. They were doomed by this idol worship. The Israelites are stubborn, like a stubborn heifer. How then can the Lord pasture them like lambs in a meadow? Ephraim, another word for Israel, is joined to idols. Leave him alone. And even when their drinks are gone, they continue their prostitution. Their rulers dearly love shameful ways. The whole nation was trapped in their sins. They got beyond saving. Verse 19, a whirlwind will sweep them away. Their sacrifices will bring them shame. Judgment was coming. And the blame rested squarely on the shoulders of the priests who'd abandoned the law of God, who'd led the people into worshipping false gods, into depths of immorality. The nation will be wiped out because there is no acknowledgement of God in the land. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. But that was hundreds of years before Jesus. What does this have to say to us today? Well, I believe Hosea chapter 4 is a solemn warning to those who follow the priests in the church today, to ministers, to preachers who teach in the church, to those who lead God's people in worship. Because the priests in Hosea's day had abandoned God's law, leaving the people in ignorance of what God required, even teaching them to worship false gods. They rejected knowledge, ignored the law. And to me, that's a solemn warning to all the preachers today, especially those famous ones who depart from Bible truth. If you want to get a book deal today, if you want to appear on Christian television, if you want to be known as a preacher, it seems that people need to say something controversial, something which is departing from the law of God. So there's a warning here for all the teachers who cut out of their Bibles the difficult bits they don't like, who'll tell us that some bits of the Bible don't apply today, who'll say that Christians don't need to obey what the Bible teaches us anymore. Some teachers are open about the bits of the Bible that they're rejecting. Others preachers are more dangerous. They don't actually base their teaching on the Bible at all. They just deliver entertaining, encouraging messages, hope, full of platitudes which aren't founded on anything at all. But the result is the same. My people are destroyed from lack of knowledge. And then those priests in Hosea's time led the Israelites into immorality, ritual prostitution. Some of those preachers today who are saying that God's standards of sexual ethics don't apply anymore. They condone, even encourage behavior, even between Christians, which was universally condemned in previous generations. The church desperately needs preachers and teachers and theologians who do not reject knowledge, who do not ignore the word of God. And we must be aware, we must beware of being led astray by teachers who exchange their glorious God for something disgraceful. Words of Paul to Timothy as he was leading the church in Ephesus, still very relevant. Preach the word, be prepared in season and out of season, correct, rebuke, encourage with great patience and careful instruction. 2 Timothy 4 verse 3, for the time will come when people will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they'll gather round them a great number of teachers who say what their itching ears want to hear. They'll turn their ears away from the truth and turn aside to myths. But you keep your head in all situation, endure hardship, do the work of an evangelist, discharge all the duties of your ministry. In today's world, full of postmodern, post-truth ideology, we must beware of preachers and teachers who compromise the Christian faith and just tell people what their itching ears want to hear. We must be faithful to what God teaches us in the Bible. But then the other great sin of the priests of Hosea's time is they led people to worship idols instead of the one true God, even offering sacrifices to those false gods. And those priests just gave the people a diet of worship, which is what they'd asked for. And I think there's a serious warning here to anybody who's entrusted with the responsibility of leading God's people in worship, whether it's clergy or whether it's also the increasing ranks of worship leaders. We have the solemn responsibility to make sure that we're actually leading people to worship God and not just giving people what they think they want. Read an interesting blog article this week reporting an Old Testament scholar, Michael Rhodes, who compared the worship of God which we find in the Psalms with the worship today reflected in the chart of the top 25 Christian worship songs. There are organizations out there that make such records on the basis of what's most downloaded, what's most sung. And Michael Rhodes found a number of themes like justice, concern for the poor and the oppressed, very important in the Psalms, but completely absent from the top 25 Christian songs that everybody's liking to sing. On the other hand, the popular songs tend to focus on the emotional encounter of the individual with God, what one author maybe unkindly describes as Jesus is my boyfriend kind of songs, which talk all the time about I and me, whereas the Psalms talk much more about we and us. So many, maybe most of the modern worship songs celebrate. They express triumph. While the Psalms so much more often talk about suffering and lament. Most of the top 25 Christian worship songs written by just a few individuals and organizations. Hillsong at the top of that list. And Michael Rhodes comments, if these professionals keep writing songs that just edit out huge portions of the biblical language of worship, then churches will have to fire them and find other resources, or our worshiping lives will be impoverished. I think that's wise. A diet of just celebration, just rejoicing, just victory is not biblical. And it isn't right for these times where many people are suffering in their faith through COVID and the knock-on. We need songs that express our struggling with questions of faith, our sadness about what we've lost in COVID. We need laments. We don't just need to be rejoicing all the time. That's just escapism. The other point, of course, made in the article about modern songs in many large popular churches, they're all about performance by the band, by the singers, rather than participation. Songs written for the bands to perform rather than the congregation to sing together. This commercialization of Christian music through YouTube, through digital downloads, has produced so many songs which Christians are very happy to sing in the kitchen or in the car, but are a long way away from the kind of worship we find in the Psalms, a long way away from what worship has been like in the church for the last 2,000 years until about the 1980s. But the hymns, the songs we use in our worship, shape the faith and the life of our churches. And unless we're really worshiping God in spirit and in truth, there's a real danger of ending up where Hosea's people ended up, with no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God. So warnings to worship leaders and songwriters, to preachers, to ministers. Let me finish by explaining why I think these warnings are particularly important for churches at this time. Because at the moment we're beginning to emerge from the massive upheaval of the coronavirus pandemic, and many churches are struggling in these days. Not only have the finances of many churches been hit very hard, so some of them are having to let their ministers go, or ministers becoming part-time instead of full-time. But in many churches, the worshippers, even the church members, are not all returning. Last 21 months have caused people to take a long look at their lives, to reevaluate their priorities. And for some people, church, or maybe the church they belonged to before anyway, just doesn't fit into their lives so much. It's not as important to them. For many people, church has become a video they can tune into from their sofas when they want to watch something recorded, rather than a community they're happy to meet up with and belong to. And there are many people who used to be very active in the churches who've been glad to have a rest over the last almost 2 years and happy not to be so busy and actually don't want to take up all their old jobs again. So as churches, we're wanting folk to return to church, which means that the temptation will be greater than ever for ministers and preachers just to tell people what they want to hear, things that are easy to hear, rather than wrestle with the hard truths of the Bible. For worship leaders, the temptation will be to give people just the popular songs they enjoy singing, rather than to lead them in the broad riches of worship, which of course include times of prayer and testimony and prophecy and silence, as well as just loud singing together. So it matters that we heed these warnings from Hosea. In Hosea's time, Israel came into God's judgment because there was no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. God's people were destroyed from lack of knowledge, and this was the fault of the priests who rejected knowledge, who ignored the law of God, who exchanged their glorious God for something disgraceful. So it was that a people without understanding would come to ruin. And these things are given for us as a warning today. Remember what happened to Israel when the priests, those who led their worship, were allowed to lead them astray. A whirlwind will sweep them away, and their sacrifices will bring them shame. He who has ears, let him hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches.